Two of the journalists who broke the story on the reach of NSA surveillance returned to the U.S. today for the first time since they began reporting on documents leaked by former contractor Edward Snowden. Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras arrived in New York this morning to receive the prestigious George Polk Award in journalism. They shared the National Security Reporting Award with fellow reporters Ewan McCaskill and Washington Post Barton Gellman. RT's Anastasia Churkina met Greenwald at the event and joins us now with more. Anastasia, you spoke with Greenwald this morning, the first time since he stepped foot onto U.S. soil after the NSA revelations. What's the significance of this return? There were concerns he may have trouble getting back into the U.S.
That's right, Lindsay. I mean, the significance of this is pretty huge because June will mark exactly 1 year since the mind-blowing revelations were made with the help of Edward Snowden, this mass surveillance conducted by the U.S. government, by the NSA. Certainly, this was a huge scandal, and 1 year onwards, these threats are still very tangible. The journalists who worked on the story felt like it was a huge question whether or not they might be detained when they come back here. Certainly, Glenn Greenwald spent the last year in Brazil, and, you know, heading here, he and Laura did not know what would happen. And today, so far, for now, these questions have been answered. They were okay. They were able to receive these awards and had no problems. But certainly that was not the case previously when they traveled. We caught up with him. This is what he told us. Take a listen.
Mr. Greenwald, how does it feel to be back in the U.S.?
Feels good. I'm happy to be here. That's why I came back.
Are you excited to get the award today?
Sure. Yeah, that's the main reason we came in the first instance. So yeah, I'm excited for it.
How was your return back home? Did you experience any difficulty at the airport?
No, it was very smooth, which is what we expected, which is why we came back, because we didn't think that the U.S. government would do something really counterproductive, and they didn't. So we're happy about that.
Well, certainly nothing counterproductive happened for now, but we did hear later Greenwald spoke to journalists, and he said that it took them about 4 to 5 months to try to figure out whether or not it was okay for them to come back to the U.S. They did not get any answers, and certainly took a kind of risk today, Lindsay.
Well, considering Greenwald has received harsh criticism in the United States, what does this mean for journalism in this country?
Well, you know, I think that's one of the most important questions in this whole story, really. One of the points being, of course, you know, the United States certainly prides itself in freedom of speech, freedom for journalists, but it really seems to only apply when it's convenient, the kind of stories that are covered, because certainly with the NSA scandal being probably the biggest story of the last decade in the U.S. in terms of this mass secret spying that the government was conducting under wraps, this is certainly a huge story, and the way these journalists who were working on this story have been treated, and the reactions were really mind-boggling. You know, we heard officials calling them possibly traitors, criminals, and so on. And Glenn Greenwald earlier today basically said that this is all a huge attempt to intimidate journalists to not be able to do their jobs. Take a listen to what he said.
There are ways to intimidate journalists. You can imprison them en masse, but there are other ways to do it. And calling journalists working on stories accomplices, or having powerful chairmen of committees specifically accuse journalists of being criminals and advocating for their prosecution, or having major media figures openly debate whether we ought to prosecute it, is a way to intensify that climate of fear.
Well, Glenn Greenwald went on to say that basically with this extra pressure and serious reactions and accusations coming from officials, the only thing that investigative journalists like him are left to do is to keep fighting even more to spread the truth.
What was said about Edward Snowden today? Greenwald has certainly, with Snowden's future remains uncertain, and Greenwald has been a huge advocate, obviously, of him. What was mentioned about him?
Right, of course. I mean, in many ways, of course, at this point, Snowden and Glenn Greenwald are intertwined. And Glenn Greenwald talked a little bit about this today, that, of course, they interact, they continue speaking. They are, you know, Snowden was, in fact, supportive of the journalists, including Glenn Greenwald, returning to the U.S. And he's basically said that, you know, despite the fact that Snowden is not necessarily maybe in a position being in Russia right now, maybe this was not his first choice to be, but at least they're saying he's not in a maximum security prison in the United States, where he still continues to face a very uncertain future. This is what Glenn Greenwald had to say about that.
For the act of bringing to the world's attention this system of mass surveillance that had been constructed in the dark, he's now threatened with literally decades in prison, probably the rest of his life. as a result of what the United States government is doing, I think is really odious and unacceptable.
And while we don't know, of course, what is going exactly to happen with Edward Snowden in the nearest future, in this particular case, the journalists don't know what's going to happen to them either. They do plan to possibly, Glenn Greenwald, of course, has a book coming out and plans to stay in the U.S. to keep talking about the substance and the NSA scandal. But whether or not they might still be facing some kind of legal consequences from the government remains to be seen, which is very shocking in itself, being the 21st century and this being journalists and not criminals by any means.
All right. Thank you. That was RT correspondent Anastasia Turkina.